Happy Wednesday, Mount members and friends. We thank you so much for joining us. This is lesson 9 in our Sheepish Bible study, which is focused on the 23rd Psalm. As always, if you're watching live on Wednesday at 12 or 6:30, we encourage you to invite someone to join you as we go through this lesson. We're live on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. You can invite someone who may be on the go. They can call in to listen at 804-203-9011. Let's get started. There are so many different Bible translations, and so each week we're using a different one to center us. This week we're listening to Psalm 23 according to the Christian Standard Bible. Listen.
The Lord is my shepherd. I have what I need. He lets me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He renews my life. He leads me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even when I go through the darkest valley, I fear no danger, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Only goodness and faithful love will pursue me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord as long as I live.
During this Bible study series, we've learned a lot about sheep, shepherds, and the Lord, our shepherd. We've tried to share some of what you may have already known about this familiar passage, but I hope that your understanding and appreciation for who God is and what God does for us has increased. So I'm going to do a quick recap in case you've missed any, and if you have, you can always go back to Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter to play catch up. Psalm 23 is only 6 verses long, but they are so meaningful. Over 8 weeks, we've dealt with 4 verses. We've talked about how God provides all our internal, external, and eternal needs, meaning we won't lack anything. We've learned about how God leads us to green pastures and takes us to still waters to drink. We've been encouraged with the realization that the Lord restores and leads us along righteous paths. We are glad to know that when life requires us to walk through a dark valley, we don't have to be afraid because the Good Shepherd is with us. And last week, Pastor Nelson talked about how God's rod and God's staff, which represent God's word and God's spirit, protect and comfort us. Those who join our After Bible Study chat have been encouraging each other as they share what these lessons mean to them. So at the end of the video, I will give more details and invite you to join us for our After Bible Study chat on Dialpad. But before that, for today, we move on to the first part of verse 5, which says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." And in most of the translations I looked at, you would find in that verse, prepare, table, in the presence of, and enemies. In preparing this lesson, I thought about many of the sermons I've heard based on Psalm 23. Most of them, when they get to this part of the chapter, use their sanctified imaginations to paint a picture of us in front of a long banquet table with a Thanksgiving-like feast set for us to enjoy. And we imagine our quote-unquote enemies enviously looking at us from a distance. And while that does sound pretty satisfying, most biblical scholars would encourage us to dive deeper into this verse's meaning. So today I want to focus on what this phrase would have meant to ancient and even contemporary shepherds, what some of the Hebrew words mean in comparison to the English translations, and then share an alternative understanding of the text. We've been using Philip Keller's book, A Shepherd Looks at Psalm 23, for much of our background information. And so I want you to listen to what he says about what this concept of the table could mean for shepherds. Remember, David was a shepherd, and so when he was writing from a familiar place. And we've edited Keller's words down a little bit for time and clarity, but I think that you can learn something here. Listen.
In thinking about this statement, it is well to bear in mind that the sheep are approaching the high mountain country of the summer ranges. These are known as allplans or tablelands, so much sought after by sheepmen. In some of the finest sheep country in the world, especially in the western United States and southern Europe, the high plateaus of the sheep ranges are always referred to as mesas, the Spanish word for tables. Oddly enough, the Kiswahili, African word for a table, is also mesa. Presumably this had its origin with the first Portuguese explorers to touch the East African coast. In fact, the use of this word is not uncommon in referring to the high, flat-topped plateaus of the continent. The classic example is Table Mountain, near Cape Town. So it may be seen that what David referred to as a table was actually the entire high summer range. Though these mesas may have been remote and hard to reach, the energetic and aggressive sheep owner takes the time and trouble to ready them for the arrival of his flocks. Early in the season, even before all the snow has been melted by spring sunshine, he will go ahead and make preliminary survey trips into this rough, wild country. He will look it over with great care, keeping ever in mind its best use for his flock during the coming season. Then just before the sheep arrive, he will make another expedition or two to prepare the tableland for them. He takes along a supply of salt and minerals to be distributed over the range at strategic spots for the benefit of the sheep during the summer. The intelligent, careful manager will also decide well ahead of time where his camps will be located, so the sheep have the best bed grounds. He goes over the range carefully to determine how vigorous the grass and upland vegetation is. He will check to see if there are poisonous weeds appearing, and if so, he will plan his grazing program to avoid them or take drastic steps to eradicate them. The sheepman clears out the water holes, springs, and drinking places for his stock. He has to clean out the accumulated debris of leaves, twigs, stones, and soil that may have fallen into the water source during the autumn and winter. He may need to repair small earth dams he has made to hold water, and he will open the springs that may have become overgrown with grass and brush and weeds. Unknown to me, the first sheep ranch I owned had a rather prolific native strand of both blue and white camas. The blue camas were a delightful sight in the spring when they bloomed along the beaches. The white camas, though a much less conspicuous flower, were also quite attractive, but a deadly menace to sheep. If lambs, in particular, ate or even just nibbled a few of the lily-like leaves as they emerged in the short grass during spring, it would spell certain death. The lambs would become paralyzed, stiffen up like blocks of wood, and simply succumb to the toxic poisons from the plants. My youngsters and I spent days and days going over the ground plucking out these poisonous plants. It was a recurring task that was done every spring before the sheep went on these pastures. Though tedious and tiring with all of the bending, it was a case of preparing the table in the presence of my enemies. And if my sheep were to survive, it simply had to be done. All of this sort of thing was in the back of David's mind as he penned these lines. I can picture him walking slowly over the summer range ahead of his flock. His eagle eye is sharp for any signs of poisonous weeds that he would pluck before his sheep got to them. No doubt he had armfuls to get rid of for the safety of his flock. To keep an eye out for predators, a good shepherd will look for signs of wolves, coyotes, cougars, and bears. If they mess with the sheep, they will hunt them down or trap them so that the flock can rest in peace. The crafty predators look down from the rim rock, watching every movement the sheep make, hoping for a chance to make a swift, sneaking attack that will stampede the sheep. Then, one of the flock is bound to fall easy prey to the attacker's fierce teeth and claws. It was always the distant sheep, the roamers, the wanderers that were picked off by the predators in an unsuspecting moment. Only the alertness of the shepherd who tends his flock on the tableland in full view of possible enemies can prevent them from falling prey to attack. It is only his preparation for such an eventuality that can possibly save the sheep from being panicked or slaughtered by their predators.
Can you see the parallel of the shepherd preparing the tableland for his sheep with the good shepherd making preparations for those of us in the Christian flock? Like sheep, especially when we are young, we feel that we have to try everything that comes our way. We have to taste this thing and that, sampling everything just to see what it's like. And we may be very well aware that some things are not good for us, that some things may even be deadly. But these things may taste or look or feel good to us, but we know that they are not good for us. They can be destructive physically, mentally, financially, and spiritually. Still, if God doesn't pluck the poisonous stuff out of our path, we're prone to put it in our mouths. So I'm thankful that the Lord, our good shepherd, is going ahead of us in every situation, anticipating what danger we may encounter and praying for us that we may not take the bait. But I need to add this: just because the shepherd has gone ahead and made every possible provision for the safety and welfare of the sheep while they are on the summer range does not mean that you will not have problems when you get there. Predators can still attack, poisonous weeds can still grow, storms can still come up over the peaks, and a dozen other hazards can haunt the high country. Too many people assume that when we become Christians, life automatically becomes problem-free. But you do know that you cannot have a mountaintop without a valley. And even on the mountaintop, there can be some rough terrain. So if you haven't heard anything else, hear this: becoming a Christian will not take away your problems, but it will give you a relationship with one who can help you handle your problems. And I will say that although experiencing a trouble-free life is impossible, trusting God to be faithful at all times is foolproof. Because we have a Savior who knows every wile, every trick, every plot, and every plan of our ultimate enemy. In fact, in God's word, we are told that Jesus was tempted in all points as we are. We know he entered fully and completely and intimately into our humanity by becoming flesh and dwelling among us. Jesus experienced our sorrows and endured our struggles in this life. Isaiah described him as a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Keller says Jesus understands us. He has identified himself with humanity. We can be sure Jesus has been in that situation before. He is in it now again with us, and because of this, the prospects of our preservation are excellent. Therefore, we would be wise to walk a little closer to Christ. Our shepherd wants us to avoid becoming prey. He wants our mountaintop times to be tranquil, and they will be if we stay close. You can do this by committing to read God's word, spending time talking to the Lord in prayer, and connecting with a community of faith, and not just on Sunday morning. If you do that, you'll be prepared for the enemy's next move. In the book, Keller adds an interesting point that I think we should consider, especially after we just had Communion Sunday. Listen.
It is not always apparent to us what tremendous personal cost it has been for Christ to prepare the table for his own. Just as the lonely, personal privation of the shepherd who prepares the summer range for his stock entails a sacrifice, so the lonely agony of Gethsemane, of Pilate's hall, of Calvary, have cost my master much. When I come to the Lord's table and partake of the communion service, which is a feast of thanksgiving for his love and care, do I fully appreciate what it has cost him to prepare this table for me? Here we commemorate the greatest and deepest demonstration of true love the world has ever known. For God looked down upon sorrowing, struggling, sinning humanity and was moved with compassion for the contrary, sheep-like creatures God had made. In spite of the tremendous personal cost it would entail to deliver them from their dilemma, God chose deliberately to descend and live amongst them, so that God might deliver them. This meant laying aside God's splendor, God's position, and God's prerogatives as the perfect and faultless one. God knew God would be exposed to terrible privation, to ridicule, to false accusations, to rumor, to gossip, and to malicious charges that branded God as a glutton, drunkard, friend of sinners, and even an impostor. It entailed losing God's reputation. It would involve physical suffering, mental anguish, and spiritual agony. In short, God's coming to earth as the Christ, as Jesus of Nazareth, was a straightforward case of utter self-sacrifice that culminated in the cross of Calvary. The laid-down life, the poured-out blood were the supreme symbols of total selflessness. This was love. This was God. This was divinity in action, delivering men from their own utter selfishness, their own stupidity, their own suicidal instincts as lost sheep unable to help themselves. Jesus told us that he had come that we might have life and have it more abundantly. Just as the shepherd is thrilled to see his sheep thriving on the high, rich summer range, so the Lord, my shepherd, is immensely pleased when he sees me flourish on the tablelands of a noble, lofty life that he has made possible for me.
So I said the plan for today is to focus on what this phrase would have meant to shepherds, which we just did. And now I want to look at what some of the Hebrew words mean in comparison to the English translation, and then share an alternative understanding of the text. Here are some interesting insights that we found about the original Hebrew words used in Psalm 23. According to the Israel Bible, a close and careful reading of the original Hebrew of this verse reveals that not only is this standard translation imprecise, but the deeper meaning of the verse is lost in most translations. So let's look at it. According to the Strong's Concordance with Hebrew and Greek lexicon, the Hebrew word used for prepare means forms, fashions, ordains, orchestrates, makes ready, sets in order, appoints, plans, develops, equips. It has the fuller meaning of arranging something. So the Lord has arranged this. The word used for table is a noun, literally means table. Some Hebrew scholars note that this comes from the root word used for moving toward a goal or a resolution. So this table that the Lord arranged could be a table set up by God for reaching a goal or a resolution to a problem. The word used for before in this context is a common biblical word literally meaning to the face of or in front of. One scholar notes that this is never meant in a confrontational way, while the word used for presence, the noun nijed, means in the presence of. It also means opposite or against. In other words, it implies a confrontational stance, leading some to believe that what is meant here is that this table is set up as a kind of peace offering to allow two sides who have confrontation to sit together and peacefully resolve their differences. The last thing I want to talk about is our understanding of the word enemies in this text and how, when we consider it, it could change the whole meaning of the verse. Did you know that the word enemy appears 90 times in the book of Psalms? There's 150 chapters in Psalm, and the word enemies or enemy appears 90 times. That's more than any other book of the Bible. So how are enemies defined? In the general context, an enemy is a person who is actively opposed or hostile to someone or something. And to be sure, the Bible never says that there are not enemies. It never hints that Christians won't have enemies, but what the Bible does tell us is how to treat our enemies. In Matthew 5:44, Jesus taught, "Love your neighbors and pray for those who persecute you." That may be the most Christian verse in the Bible and goes against every fiber of our natural instincts. The word Jesus used for love is agape, which is translated as to truly desire that which is in the highest and best interest of the other. It does not mean that you have to like them, invite them over for dinner, or enjoy their company. It does mean, however, that if you love Jesus and desire to obey his commandments, then you will want that which is in the highest and best interest of all others, even your enemy. You cannot wish them harm or evil, and you definitely should not cause it. So that's the traditional take, but I want us now to consider another way to look at enemies in this verse. In preparing for today, I came across a Jewish blogger named Nina who recalled how her rabbi used this text for a sermon on Yom Kippur. She writes about how through his sermon she learned that the word translated my enemies technically does not mean enemies as we think of them. Her rabbi explained in Hebrew that there's a different word for that. The word used here in Psalm 23 verse 5 means narrow, tight, cramped, restricted, to bind, to cause distress, to press hard upon. Thus, the word in Psalm 23, so often translated as enemies, actually is a word for those people or things which oppress or distress me. According to Rabbi Eli, the line really means, you prepare a table before me in the presence of those people and those things that cause me great distress. And I like that translation, and I want to add on to it by sharing what I read in this book, Psalm 23, an everyday psalm. There, the author provides another way to read this verse and other psalms about enemies. Listen, and during the After Bible Study chat, I want you to let us know what you think about it.
In teaching a class on this psalm, I handed out a blank note card to each participant and asked them to list 3 enemies. They had a difficult time with the assignment. None could think of 3, and many could not list even 1. Now, of course, they knew there were people who did not like them. There were people whose company they did not enjoy. They knew difficult people. They had encountered others who had stepped on their toes, been unkind, or jumped in line ahead of them. But enemies, not really. This verse, then, will not mean much to readers who can think of no enemies. The question was then considered, because so much of Psalm 23 is metaphor and uses symbolic illustrations, and because likening God to a shepherd of sheep is metaphor, is it possible that references to the word enemies or enemy might also be metaphor? Rather than referring to conquering military or personal enemies, might the psalmist have a deeper symbolic meaning to this phrase? Almost every other verse in Psalm 23 possesses this kind of depth, so why not the reference to enemies? What if, instead of the word enemies, you substitute the word problems? Other substitution words might include challenges, obstacles, hurdles, adversity, or burdens.
So what do you think about that? If we make the substitution in this and all the Psalms with references to enemies, to problems or challenges, I think it takes on a whole new meaning because we all have identifiable problems, challenges, obstacles, and issues. So this week, reread some of the Psalms that you love that talk about enemies and replace the substitution and see if this metaphoric understanding does not make the meaning more clear to you. This is not the question of the week, but I do want you to consider this. We come to the table God prepares for us even as we worry about our problems and challenges. I want you to consider, how can we fully embrace God's banquet when we are preoccupied with our enemies, whether real or whether we're using the substitution of problems, challenges, and worries? Ask yourself, which will claim my time and attention, my problem or my provider? As I shared earlier, each week at the end of the Bible study, we ask a question of the week. Then we encourage members to log off of Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube and go on to Dialpad, which is our secure, private meeting for our After Bible Study chat. There we answer the question of the week, we hear some prayer requests, announcements, and close together in prayer. This week's question is this: how has God prepared a table before you in the presence of your enemies, your problems, or your challenges? In other words, we're asking you to share a testimony of how the Lord, your shepherd, provided for you in the midst of a difficult season or situation. How has God prepared a table before you in the presence of your enemies, in the presence of your problems and challenges? That concludes our Bible study. We thank you again for joining us. Before we go, I invite you to join us for our prayer call tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. You can call 804-203-9011 for a brief devotional, prayer request, and closing out in prayer. If you or someone you know is in need of groceries, our food pantry will be open this Friday from 12 to 1 p.m. You are encouraged to come out for Sunday school on Sunday morning at 9:30 a.m. We have classes for men, women, children, and youth. Just a note for our friends who join us for Bible study each week, we will be off next Wednesday as we want to give our staff and church members time to rest and be with their family in preparation for Thanksgiving. We'll be back continuing this series on Wednesday, November 29th. All right, it's time to head over to the After Bible Study chat. You can get there in 3 ways. Download the Dialpad Meetings app, which allows you to see us and we can see you on video. Or you can go to meetings.dialpad.com/SMZBC. Or you can call 804-203-9011. All right, thank you. See you